So during the last presentation, who checked their phone? Maybe to look for an email, check Twitter, or even just look at last night's football score. Or maybe you didn't check but you were tempted. Now I think if we're honest, the vast majority will admit that we're at least tempted to look at something else while we're listening to a presentation. And it's that phenomenon that I wanted to talk to you about today. The fact that it's harder than ever to get a consumer's attention. In the poetic words of T.S. Eliot, we're distracted from distraction by distraction. So for the next 20 minutes, I want to talk about why that's the case, and more importantly, what as marketers we can do about it. How can we make our communications as effective as possible when people aren't necessarily paying as much attention as we want? So firstly, why? Now I think the main reason, the root cause that attention is declining is that we live in an information-rich age. One of the first people to ever speak about this was a man called Herbert Simon. So he won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1978. And he said, what information consumes is rather obvious. Information consumes attention of the recipient. So a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. So a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. Now, Herbert Simon was talking in the 1970s, so before the advent of the internet. So the situation we have now is far more extreme than even his predictions. Because the internet is essentially a machine for distraction. If you think about the last time that you read a newspaper article online, what happened? You go and choose the article that you want to read. There's a sidebar of other interesting things to distract you. And then as you're reading, you might hear an email alert flash up, a text from a colleague, or maybe an RSS feed tells you that a blogger that you like has just posted. So more than ever, we're seeing more and more distractions. And those are starting to have long-term repercussions. There's a fantastic book and it's called The Shallows. And in that book, he talks about two big long-term trends that are affecting consumers. The first is that he suggests that consumers are losing the ability to concentrate deeply. Now, this is probably more contentious of his suggestions. And his argument is that the brain is essentially plastic. And that's a neurologist term which means if we do a mental activity for long enough, if we do it in a repeated manner, then the very physical wiring of our brain, the physical nature of our brain will change. Now the fact that our brain changes when we do things repeatedly is reasonably well accepted amongst neurologists. There's a very famous experiment by Eleanor McGwire, who is a neurologist or a neuroscientist at UCL. And she looked at the MRI scans of taxi drivers. And she compared those MRI scans with a nationally representative group. And what she found was that the posterior hippocampus, the place where spatial representation is stored in the brain, or where it's most associated with, was enlarged in those taxi drivers. And more importantly, from a causation point of view, the longer someone had been a taxi driver, the more enlarged their hippocampi were. So Carr's taken this finding and he said, well, we're spending a huge amount of time on the internet, this machine for distraction. Now, UCOM figures say we spend 2 hours 51 in the UK now on the internet. And he says that repeated exposure to this machine for distraction is having a long-term change in the very makeup of consumers' minds. Now, there's a slight element of speculation there from Carr in that area that consumers are no longer able to concentrate as they once were. But in his second point, it's a bit more solid ground. And that's the time that we spend, this nearly 3 hours on the internet, is a moment of great distraction. And what that means is that consumers, for a vast majority of the money we're spending on advertising, According to the IAB and the PwC, we're spending, the UK advertisers are spending £8.6 billion in 2015 on digital advertising. That's occurring at a time when consumers are not paying as much attention as we'd like, and therefore message comprehension is slightly lower. Now, there's a number of experiments he references. So one of the really early ones was by a scholar at the University of Alberta, David Mile, and he came up with an ingenious idea to compare comprehension levels for a short story. So he got a group of students, and he either gave them this short story by Elizabeth Bowen called The Demon Lover, and he either gave them that short story without any distractions, they could just read it, or with a series of hyperlinks. And what he found was when people had the hyperlinks, the level of comprehension was far lower. So 3/4 of people couldn't remember significant details, compared to about 10–15% amongst the group that saw it without the hyperlinks. So the fact that there was more information elsewhere was destroying people's attention. Other studies more recently have shown that when people are given texts on a screen versus paper, so this is from Mangan in 2013, memory of some of the key points declines again. Now, this is, as I say, a key issue because so much of our money is being spent at a time when the consumers are not necessarily paying attention. Now, normally, most, I think, people who comment on this area are quite full of doom and gloom. You know, that there's an apocalyptic story about consumers not paying attention and therefore money being wasted. And I think that's partially right, but it misses the most important and interesting area. Yes, there is a genuine problem that consumers aren't paying attention, but this increased level of distraction also brings opportunities and even benefits to marketers. And it's those opportunities and those benefits that I want to talk about. And I want to talk about 3 areas in particular. So I want to talk about the work of Leon Festinger and his idea about how distraction can help us persuade brand rejectors. I want to talk about Colin Cherry and the cocktail party effect and the power of personalisation to overcome distraction. And then finally, how we can adjust our creative in a world of distraction. So firstly, Festinger. Now, Leon Festinger is perhaps one of the most respected social psychologists of the 20th century. He's the 5th most cited psychologist of that era, behind people like Skinner and Freud. And one of the areas that really interested him was confirmation bias. Now, that's the idea that once we have an idea in our head, it's very hard to overturn. Because once the brain's formed its opinion about a subject, any new information we get is interpreted through a lens of that feeling. Now, an experiment we did at ZenithOptimedia, it's one of my favourite experiments, but also one of the most depressing ones we've done, was around the election last year. So we invented a fictitious new policy. There was going to be a penny on VAT, and it was going to pay for 10,000 nurses. And we told 1,000 people this. 500 were told it came from Labour, and 500 were told it came from the Conservatives. Then we asked them lots of different questions about our clients, and then at the end of the survey, so they've hopefully forgotten the earlier question, we asked them their voting intentions. And we crossed the 2 bits of data. So we saw that when Conservative voters thought the policy came from the Tories, they liked it 3 times more than when it came from Labour. And Labour voters liked it 4 times more when they thought it came from Labour rather than the Conservatives. So quite depressing for Democrats, but great for marketers. And I think the issue there is that if this is happening on a really important topic that people might think about lots, think how for your brands that's a problem for the group of rejectors you have. Because any information you give them would be interpreted through a lens of negativity. Now, that's the problem, but luckily Festinger's done quite a lot of work about a potential solution. So he was, during his career at MIT and Stanford, And when he was at Stanford, he worked with a man called Nathan Maccabee. And the two of them came up with an experiment to try and find what are the moments when rejectors can have their opinions overturned. And he recruited a group of people who were members of a fraternity in the US. And he played them an audio argument about why fraternities were morally wrong. And he either played that argument to people who heard it on its own, or to people who were also played an entertaining silent film. And at the end of the audio recording, he questioned all the students as to whether or not their opinions had changed. And what he found was that in the distracted scenario, so that time when people were also listening to the film, they were 10% more likely to have changed their opinion than when they gave the argument their full attention. And his belief is that the brain is really good at coming up with counter-arguments. So if you tell it something it doesn't believe, it'll come up with a counter-argument to maintain its original position. So when it was being distracted by information, that ability was minimised. And I think the findings here are really interesting for marketers. That what we're normally told is if you want to persuade a rejecter of your brand, you should seek out moments when they're deeply engaged, when they'll take in all your messages, all the great things about your product. But actually, what Festinger shows is that's exactly the wrong thing to do. The time we should talk to people if we want to overturn entrenched opinions is when they're distracted. And there are, as we've discussed, phenomenal range of times when that's the case. You can choose a medium that people are generally doing something else. So streaming, something like Spotify. People are listening to your ad, but also doing something else at the same time. Or you can look within a medium at when the particular moments when people are doing something else. So Nielsen, for example, say 35% of TV time is taken up with second screening. So you can cherry pick the TV programs when people are likely to be doing something else if you want to persuade rejectors. So great opportunity, I think, from Festinger. The next approach for dealing with a distracted consumer is what's called the cocktail party effect. Now, it gets its name because Colin Cherry, who was a cognitive scientist at Imperial College, came up with it when he was on a night out. So he'd gone out with a large group of friends, and he was talking to one of those friends, listening to his anecdote, and the hubbub of noise and conversation around him just faded to a blur. Then during the night, while he's having that chat, he hears from across the room one of his other friends mentioning Colin Cherry's name. His ears prick up and he heard it. And that got him thinking. He said to himself, well, why was it that I heard my name being mentioned? It was no louder than the preceding conversation and I heard nothing else they said. What was it that made me hear it? They wouldn't say it any louder. And so after a few more beers, he starts to formulate an idea that would probably take up the next 10, 15 years of his life. That was what he called the cocktail party effect. And in essence, it's the idea that we are subconsciously aware of a huge amount of information. Sights, smells, sounds. We're taking all that information in, but only a tiny proportion makes it to our rational mind. And that has to be the case, because otherwise we'd be completely overwhelmed with the volume of information. Now, as the cocktail party effect shows, one of the criteria that the mind uses to choose whether or not to push the information to the rational front of mind is whether or not it's personally relevant. Now, again, as marketers, that's a fantastic opportunity. The web has created a distracted consumer. It creates a distracted moment, but at the same time, it provides a partial solution. It's now, because of the sheer volumes of data available, very easy to personalise messages. Now, of course, personalising an ad message doesn't just mean using someone's name. The danger with that is it's invasive, it probably brings up privacy issues, and it's just going to irritate a lot of people. But there are softer ways of personalising things, making them relevant, for example, by the locality someone's receiving the message. So we've done quite a lot of work at Zenith about this, and for some of our performance clients, acquisition clients, where they've localised a call to action, they've seen about a 10 to 15% decline in cost per acquisition. And so that's got us thinking about what could be driving that. So we ran an experiment again, a very simple survey. 502 people took part, a nationally representative group. And again, we showed them two slightly different messages. So the control group saw a fictitious offer from Npower. So we always use Npower for these tests. And I'm hoping one day we're going to pitch for Npower, because I can turn up at the first meeting with hundreds of slides about what they can do. So in this scenario, we invented a fictitious offer. So we said to the control group, if you switch to Npower, the average UK household saves 100 quid. And then because we'd captured people's address, we could also run a test message, which was localised. So to Londoners, it said the average Londoner will save 100 quid if they switch to Npower. And what we found was, when we asked people at the end how appealing the message was, in the control situation, it's the UK example, 4% found it highly appealing, whereas in the test scenario, when it was localised, 10% found it highly appealing. So that's a 2.5-fold increase, a huge difference from something very, very simple to act upon. So again, what the web creates as a problem, it also gives us the tools to resolve. And I think this is a really, really simple technique that can be applied for most brands to improve relevance and therefore improve the likelihood that a message will be understood and noticed. So then the final example is around creative adaptation. So if we are living in an era when people's attention spans are dwindling, in which they're more distracted than ever, then the creative that's ideal for that is shorter, is punchier. But unfortunately, at the moment, there hasn't been an adaptation to that. So a colleague and I looked through a lot of Barb data, which tracks TV ads, and we looked at 2010 and saw that the mean TV commercial length is exactly the same as in 2015. And there's the data up there shows we saw that 49% of TV ads in 2010 were 30 seconds, 49% in 2015 were 30 seconds. So the format hasn't changed at all. And it's not just the format, it's the content. We also looked at Nielsen data, and Nielsen track all the creative that runs. So we looked at 2010, a huge sample of posters randomly selected, and then the same in 2015. And we saw the average poster headline was the average poster, the length of copy on it was 12 words in 2010, and it was 12 words in 2015. And a similar story for press headlines. 8 words in 2010, barely moved to 7 and a bit in 2015. So again, brands haven't yet adapted to this new environment. And if your competitors haven't adapted, I think that's a great opportunity for you. You can either say, well, we know how consumers are changing, therefore we're going to go out with a general message and we're going to make it shorter and pithier and reflect that change. Or you might want to say, well, consumers have generally changed. Our message still requires attention. It still requires kind of a depth of immersion. And therefore, we're going to cherry pick those rare moments in which you can get a consumer's attention, whether it's cinema or wherever else. Now, those three opportunities, I think, are very simple ways of reacting to the lack of consumer attention. But are they going to completely resolve a general cultural problem? And I think the answer there is probably no. They might improve communications there, but they're not going to make the problem go away. And I think, just to end up with, that shouldn't be seen as too much of an issue. And I think the reason why it's captured is an old and very famous joke. I don't know if people have heard the one about two friends going out for a walk in a wood one day. And the two friends are walking down, one winter, down a woodland path. And as they go round a corner, they startle a very hungry and very angry grizzly bear. And the grizzly bear sees them, turns, and starts charging ferociously towards them. Now, the quicker thinking of the two friends drops to his feet, whips off his hiking boots, sticks on his trainers, and turns to start running. And his other friend's a bit puzzled, or he might be an acquaintance. His other friend's puzzled because he says, well, what's the point of running? You're never going to outrun a grizzly bear. They're the fastest animal in the wood. And his friend turns around and says, oh, I don't need to outrun the grizzly bear. I just need to outrun you. And I think that's a brilliant analogy for marketing, for business. When we have huge problems like the changing of attention span, we shouldn't worry if our marketing completely solves that problem, but just are we going to be adapting our communications so they're slightly better than our competitors? Because if we do that, we'll be successful. And I find that a deeply liberating thought and makes you far more open to wanting to test some of these scenarios. And I hope it makes you more open to testing them too. So thank you very much for your time. If anyone was interested in the experiments I talked about that either Zenith have done or the social psychologists have done, please follow me on Twitter, as that's generally what I post about. Or contact me via Twitter. Thank you.